Hey guys, it's Shara from Woodshop Diaries and welcome to my mudroom hallway. It's not very exciting yet, but in this video I'm going to share how I built some seating and some storage for it to take it from looking like this to, just kidding, the final reveal is at the end of the video and we have to put the work in first to build it. So if you're ready to get building, let's go. This video was sponsored by my friends at Arauco. I'll be using AraucoPly Sanded Plywood for the cabinets in this build and their edge-glued pre-primed trim boards for the trim and face frames. I'll link both of these products in the video description below if you want to check them out. First, I started by cutting down the plywood to build the main cabinets for this mudroom. To give you an idea of where we're headed, my design consisted of 2 tall cabinets on each end, an open bench seat in the middle with open cubbies at the top. Very simple, but with tons of storage. I used my circular saw and Craig rip cut to rip down a couple sheets of plywood to about 16 inches wide. I'll use these strips to build 2 tall cabinets for this mudroom design. I've provided the dimensions and cut diagrams in the printable plans linked in the video description, so all of the details can be found there. After I ripped these strips, I needed to trim them to length. Each cabinet will have a bottom, middle, and a top panel, so I cut all of these first, 6 in total. Then I needed to cut the 2 long sides. I decided to make these cabinets go from floor to ceiling, and my house has 8-foot ceilings. I couldn't make the long sides a full 8-foot or I wouldn't be able to tilt them upright once I got them installed. So I did a little math to figure out how tall I could make them. Anyone remember the Pythagorean theorem? I used that to figure out that if my diagonal is 8 foot or less, then I can cut these cabinets to about 94.5 inches tall. Just to allow for some wiggle room, I cut them to 94 inches and saved these 2-inch strips that I cut off to use later with the drawers. With these pieces cut, I could start to assemble the 2 tall cabinets, and to keep things simple, I used pocket holes and screws to build these boxes. While we assemble, let's talk about why Arauco. Arauco is a leading manufacturer of composite panels, premium plywood, millwork, lumber, and wood pulp. And in addition to providing quality products, Arauco is passionate about sustainable forestry all over the globe. They're the first forest products company to be third-party certified as carbon neutral. And they produce many of their products from their own certified sustainably managed forests or from recycled or recovered materials. You can find AraucoPly plywood, trim, and lumber products available at the Home Depot and from other local distributors. You can check out all that they have to offer and find your local distributor on their website, arauco.com. Their sanded pine plywood that I'm using here is graded AC, so the A side is perfectly smooth, which is great for painted projects, which I'm building. Once these tall cabinet carcasses were assembled, they needed to be trimmed out. Arauco offers edge-glued trim boards in various finishes, thicknesses, and widths. Since they're pre-primed and already smooth, they're perfect for trim and painted projects. Here, I'm using standard 1x2s, 1x3s, and 1x4 sizes for these face frames. I always recommend test fitting the face frame before adding any glue, just to make sure that it fits first. Once I made sure that these fit, I applied some wood glue and nailed the face frames onto the front of each tall cabinet. Then I used some wood filler to smooth the joints and fill all the nail holes. I totally forgot to add the toe kick and the back supports to these cabinets while I was assembling them, so I ended up coming back the next day to install a toe kick piece here at the bottom and 2 supports on the back. These back supports will allow me to secure these cabinets to the wall studs once I get them in place. Once these were installed, I can move on to the doors and drawers. I've built cabinet doors several different ways over the years, and honestly, I've not really enjoyed any of them. I don't love building cabinet doors, but for this project, I did try a method that I haven't before just to mix things up. I cut 1x3s to assemble a frame the overall size that I wanted my doors to be. You could assemble this using pocket holes and screws, but I plan to route out the back side of this frame to install the plywood panels. So to avoid any issues of routing into a screw, I opted for wood glue and dowels here versus pocket holes. I assembled 2 identical frames, 1 door for each tall cabinet, and I clamped these until the glue had dried. Once the glue was dry, I used a rabbeting bit in my router to route a groove in these openings on each door. I routed this to about 3/8 of an inch deep, and then I chiseled out the corners so that they were square. Now I could cut 1/4 inch plywood panels to install into these sections. I applied some wood glue and clamped them into the door frames. While the glue was drying on these doors, I started building the drawers. Since I added these face frames onto the front of the tall cabinets, I needed to add some spacer blocks here to mount the slides onto. So remember those 2-inch strips that I cut from the tall sides of the cabinets? I used those here. I screwed these into the side of the cabinet in the bottom section, then mounted 16-inch ball bearing drawer slides onto them. Then I began cutting my drawer box pieces. I like to cut dados into the sides of my drawer boxes to install the drawer bottoms, so I cut these on my table saw. I assembled my drawer boxes using pocket holes and screws, but on the front pieces, I made sure to drill these pocket holes as close to the top and bottom edges as possible. That way, when I add the drawer front in a minute, it will cover these holes. I installed these drawer boxes onto the slides in the cabinet so that they were flush to the front edge of the face frame. There are lots of ways to make a drawer front, but in this case, I screwed together a simple frame using the same 1x3 edge glued boards that I used for the doors, and I just glued these onto the front of the drawer box. This frame will cover the pocket holes, like I mentioned before, and it will also match the framing on the door. And with that, I left the tall cabinets for now and moved on to building the cubbies that will go above the bench. I ripped plywood strips to 12 inches wide for this and cut 2 sides, a top and a bottom, and 2 middle dividers to create a cabinet box about 6 foot long and 18 inches tall. Pocket holes and screws would work totally fine for assembly here as well, but no matter which side I put them on with the dividers and the bottom panel, they were going to show on one side or the other, and I didn't want to have to fill these holes. So instead, for this cabinet, I just assembled using screws through the side panels. I was going to need a way to secure this cabinet into the wall studs, so I did add 2 back supports, one at the top of the left section and one at the top of the right section of this cabinet. Then I screwed in the divider panels, making sure to keep everything square. Once this cabinet was assembled, I made a face frame from 1x3s to go onto the front. Just like the tall cabinet face frame, I assembled with pocket holes and screws, then test fit and glued and nailed it onto the front. This part of the build was obviously, and thankfully, much quicker than the tall cabinet part. So at this point, all that's left to build is the bench, which is thankfully the easiest part. For the bench seat, I plan to use an inexpensive butcher block countertop. I'll link exactly what I used in the description, but first I did need to assemble some supports to go beneath it. I wanted the underside of this bench to be open, so like not a cabinet. Basically, I just needed a support on each side and then 2 dividers to go into the middle. So I cut 8 pieces of plywood and glued them in pairs to make these 4 support blocks. After the glue had dried, I glued and nailed a piece of 1x3 onto the front of these pieces. For the 2 end supports, I added these 1x3s so that one edge was flush, but for the middle dividers, I centered them. This will make a little bit more sense once I install these later. At this point, everything that needed to be painted was assembled, so I started on my least favorite part, painting. I prepped everything for paint by giving it a final sanding, caulking where needed, and making sure that all the nail holes were filled. I applied a coat of primer to the plywood. Thankfully, I got to skip that on the majority of the trim since it was already primed. And after that had dried, I gave it a light sanding and applied 2 coats of paint. And just in case you're curious about the color here, I'm using Sherwin-Williams Evergreen Fog. Once the paint was dry, it was time to install this. Finally. So to prep this space, I removed the baseboard and vacuumed up all the dust bunnies and dog hair, and then I began at the back corner with the first tall cabinet. I found the studs in the wall, marked them, and then scooted this cabinet in place. I secured the cabinet to the wall studs that I marked through the back supports. I secured one end bench support to this tall cabinet. Now, the butcher block countertop that I got was 25 inches by 74 inches, so I first ripped it down to 16.5 inches wide, then I trimmed it to 72 inches long. I saved these leftover pieces though because I did reuse part of it for an optional shelf later. I set this bench seat in place on the end supports to help me position the cabinet above it. I used some scrap plywood pieces cut to 48 inches long to help me position this middle cabinet 48 inches up from the bench seat. Then I secured it to the wall studs through the top back supports. I apologize in advance for some of these camera angles inside the house. It was difficult to fit the tripod in the right places while still being able to do the work in this hallway, so just bear with me here. Next, I worked on finishing up the bench. I debated on how I wanted to attach the bench seat to the supports. At first, I was going to use corner brackets, but I ended up changing my mind and using these figure 8 brackets because I already had them in the shop. I added these to the tops of the divider pieces and to the tops of each end support. Then I slid these underneath the bench seat and used some wood screws from the bottom to secure the brackets to the seat. The dividers were a pretty snug fit, so they don't move easily, but if they're hit or kicked, the bottom can still move a little. However, once I install the baseboard between them, I think this will help hold them in place. The final piece to put in place was the other tall cabinet. So I just scooted this in and secured to the top cabinet, the bench support, and the wall studs. This project felt never ending, but it's almost together. I wanted some adjustable shelves on the top of the tall cabinets, so I drilled shelf pin holes in each side. I could have totally done this earlier, but I wanted to do it after painting so I didn't get paint in the holes. So I waited until the very end. At this point, I could add the doors. I installed 2 hinges on the door in the shop, then carried them in to install them onto the cabinets. First, I tried with only the 2 hinges, but after testing it out, I ended up having to go back and add a 3rd hinge in the middle. So just pretend that there's a middle hinge here. I didn't want to refilm that part. I cut to fit crown molding to wrap around the top cabinets and to run along the top of the middle cabinet, touched up the paint, and added some shelves and coat hooks inside the cabinets. And also, just for a little detail, I added the leftover piece of butcher block as a small shelf along the back wall. This was mostly just for decoration, but it could be handy to hold small items like your phone, keys, mail, gloves, whatever. And the very last piece was reinstalling the baseboards on the sides and along the back underneath the bench. I know there was a lot of finishing details, but with that, this project is complete. I know that you'll ask me, what about this back wall? And I haven't decided yet what I want to do with it, so I will revisit this again later. But for now, we're keeping our coats and hats stored away inside the cabinets where we don't have to look at them. To be honest, we've never had a mudroom before, so we're still figuring out how we really want to use this space. But the seating is handy and the storage is nice too, so we can customize as we see fit as time goes on. For now, this hallway is a heck of a lot more functional than it used to be, and for that, I'm excited. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this project come to life, and if you're ready to tackle your next DIY project, check out the links below for Arauco materials and grab the printable plans in the description as well. Thanks so much for watching, friends, and until next time, happy building!